Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Why don't we start with a brief prayer? So if you want to bow your heads. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Lord of all wisdom, be in our minds, be in our hearts, and allow us to see the eternal word, which is you, in everything we learn today. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it. As we dive into philosophy, and I'll explain what philosophy is, doing the groundwork for that, before we go into our first lesson on proving God's existence, which I'm very excited for. So thank you for being here today. I'm happy I'm making my defense of philosophy here at a place called St. John Paul II Catholic Church. That's a much bigger difference than what Socrates had to do in defending philosophy in ancient Athens, where he was ultimately put to death. So I hope you won't do the same thing for me today. Excellent. Well, what is philosophy? What is philosophy about? It's about wisdom, in a word. In the Bible, the word wisdom is mentioned over 300 times. The only words mentioned more than wisdom in the Bible are love and faith, which are very important things, as we know as Catholics. So, in order to get to wisdom, you need a love of wisdom, right? And that's what philosophy literally means. The word means love of wisdom. And so hopefully that love will be infectious, and you'll catch the good infection today. This is a great quote by our patron, John Paul II, that I would like to share with you guys before we start. It goes, quote, "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of the truth." It's so beautiful. And so he knows that faith is a kind of knowing. You know, if you practice the faith for 40, 50, 60 years, you're going to know more about God than I do. But at the same time, it's always important to use our reason, which is God-given, as we know, to know God even more. Know the definitions, know the truths about God, so we can enter more deeply into relationship with Him. The medievals had a great phrase in which they said, God wrote two books, the Bible and nature. The Bible and nature. So in this class, we're going to be learning about nature, God's natural world, how we fit into it, and how our minds can penetrate it and really understand it well. Another thing about philosophy is that you need the right attitude before you start doing it. One of my mentors always said, philosophy begins in wonder. Philosophy begins in wonder. And I think wonder can be summarized well just by thinking of how each of us was when we were 5 years old. You know, we annoyed our mommy and daddy by asking why to absolutely everything. We wanted to know everything about everything, right? And we still want that, although sometimes, you know, we have a lot of duties nowadays that can be kind of covered up, but we want to reignite that spark, wondering why, and entering deeply into it after you ask why. So eventually you can rest, you can be at peace with the truth, and you can live in the truth. Also, I'm sure we know people in our modern age who have walked away from the Catholic faith, and that can sometimes be because of mental roadblocks. Roadblocks on how God works, the problem of evil, how can God be transcendent, how can He be all good and all-knowing. So these sorts of things, how can He exist? These sorts of things we can show by reason. We can use our minds and make good rational arguments to clear away those roadblocks for our friends and family who might need them. So it's important. So feel free to bring anyone who's agnostic, atheistic, to these courses, or send them the video. We'll have them on YouTube. Great. There's also a great C.S. Lewis quote that basically says, you can never be too careful about your reading when you're an atheist. So I think the same thing goes for what you watch. So feel free to share this with them. Hopefully God will make an impact through it. Excellent. So that's the groundwork for philosophy. And how this talk is going to go is for the next 35 minutes, you're going to enter into purgatory. And I'm sure all of you are Catholic, or most of you are, so you're used to things like that, purgatory, before you get to heaven, which is the Q&A, relatively. Life in God is trialogue, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? So dialogue's much closer to that than monologue, which is what I'll be doing for the next 35 minutes before about 20 minutes for questions. And so I'm about to commit the sin of lecture, which is at least a venial sin. Great. Okay. So the first topic is proving the existence of God. This is really high stakes, right? Because if we're wrong, then it's like we have this imaginary friend that we talk about for our entire lives who doesn't really exist, right? And so atheists would rightfully think we're crazy. But at the same time, if you're an atheist and God exists, it's like you come home from Christmas break for a full month and you never once even say hi. You never acknowledge your parents. You just move throughout the house. So that's just as crazy. So the stakes are very high when it comes to if God exists. And I don't take just the sort of low view or a view that even a lot of Christians have, that you can have the leap of faith that God exists. No, but I'm going to say you can prove that God exists. You can know this for a fact. So it's a stronger claim, but it's backed up by our Catholic faith, and it's backed up by reason, which is what we're going to be using today. Great. So again, I'm not talking about a belief, opinion, or probability, but certain proof that God exists. And I'm not saying it's easy to see it either, right? We're fallen, we have disordered passions. It can be hard to go through these arguments, for sure, when we'd rather be, watching TV or doing something else. But that doesn't mean that we can't know them for certain. And also a little bit more, there's a difference between certitude, right, which is a feeling of certainty. We've all had moments where we feel certain that we did this thing this way. We locked the door, we turned off, the stove or something, but it didn't always work out that way, right? So there's a difference between feeling certain and then an actual certainty, right, which is about objective reality. Many people nowadays think that only the scientific method is the way to prove something, right? Now, I don't actually take that view, right? So the scientific method is very useful, but you can't actually prove that solely through the scientific method, right? The statement, the scientific method is the only way to prove something, doesn't fit under your microscope. And that's kind of a trite way to put it, but it doesn't go through the scientific method. It's arguing in a circle. It's self-refuting. Rather, I would say that, and bear with me here, we could say that Aristotelian syllogisms is a way to prove something certainly. And so Aristotle was the great philosopher of ancient Athens, and then a syllogism is what I'll describe here. So in a syllogism, you have 2 or 3 or even 4 premises, right? And so premises is just another word for a truth claim, right? So all men are mortal. This is a truth claim. It could be, it could not be. And then another truth claim, premise 2, would be Socrates is a man, right? The ancient Athenian philosopher. Now, those could be wrong, those could be right, but they're 2 truth claims. Now, I would conclude, if those were true, that Socrates is mortal. Socrates is going to die, and he already did. So, we need to know, in a syllogism, are the premises true? Are all men mortal? Yes, we know that from our experience. And then is Socrates a man? Yes, we know from the manuscripts that Plato wrote that Socrates indeed was a man. And Socrates would die because he's mortal, right? So does that follow from the 2 premises? And we can see it does. It makes sense, and it is in fact true. And we also see that the terms are very clear. We know what men are, men and women in this case. We know what mortality is, to lack life or to lose life. And we know who Socrates is, right? A very prominent figure, right? So we know these things. We know the terms. We know the premises are true. And we know the conclusion follows from the premises. And so if we have all those 3 ingredients, we can know something certainly. We can know something for a fact. And so those are kind of the tune of the arguments that I'll be making today. And then, of course, please ask questions during the Q&A about them. But that's sort of the groundwork I wanted to lay. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few arguments, or several arguments, and then I look forward to your questions afterwards. So this is the argument from degrees of perfection. So we observe in our universe that there are better and worse things, right? It's better to get an A than an F. It's better to have a freshly mowed lawn than a terrible lawn, right? So we know that there are better and worse things, like on a sliding scale. But there must be an absolute standard to put these things in relativity to. Otherwise, there's no scale at all. Everything just falls along a horizontal line. They have to go towards something, a better, and ultimately a best. And so the standard of goodness or truth or beauty is what we call God. Let me back up for a moment. So what we call God, I'm not saying is the God of the Bible, right? That takes revelation to give it to us. What I'm trying to prove is a thin slice of God, right? Attributes that can only be a divine creator, a divine maker, a divine first cause. And so this is what I'm saying when I say this is what we call God. Great. So some people might deny that there are indeed degrees of perfection. They might be what a lot of people call a relativist, right? Everything is the same, different strokes for different folks. But no one actually can practically believe this. And you can show them that this belief actually leads to a bunch of craziness, insanity. You know, it's like, let's say you lived in northern Arizona and you wanted to take your son to the Grand Canyon, which was just a stone throws away. It happened to be. And he kept telling you, no, this mud pie that I'm making in the back of the yard here is so much better than any Grand Canyon. You would think he's clinically insane or just stubborn. Probably stubborn, yeah. But this is what it logically leads to. If you want to say that there's no degrees of goodness that we can actually see with our minds and see intuitively. So it leads to a crazy conclusion. Therefore, the other way, the way I propose, is what follows. Okay. So the next argument is the argument from the principle of sufficient reason. That's a mouthful. Let me explain what that means. So the idea of the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR is what I'll call it, is that everything, event, has an explanation for why it is the case that the event happened. Okay, so let's say that I have a giant hat, like a magician's hat, and out of this hat, I pull out a purple alligator. Okay. Now, you would think, wow, is there a trap door underneath this podium? How do you do that? Or is there something else in the hat? You would first look for an explanation, right? And you would first look for a natural explanation, something that I came up with in a very clever way. Now, if you kind of investigate after I talk, you look around and you see that there's no way there could have been a trap door or something like that, and you don't think I could have been that clever, then you would move on to a mental cause, right? Am I seeing things? What's going on with me? You would be a little bit alarmed, but you would move on to another cause. Now, let's say that you went to a psychiatrist and they said you were doing all right, you were doing fine. Then you would go on to a supernatural cause. Did God make this a miracle? This happened because of God. And if somehow you could verify that it wasn't, then you would, move on to some other cause. But the key point is that you would always look for a cause, right? There's always an explanation for what we do and what happens. And so even if it's a supernatural cause, like a miracle, there's always a cause for any kind of event. We all know that. Also, if everything has an explanation, and the more we look at things that are complex and see that there's an even greater explanation for them, right? So this little button on my shirt, this is a very simple explanation. It's to make sure my shirt stays together. It's got a very singular purpose, right? But something like behind me, like the altar, which has a complex purpose, right? Because it gets into the Eucharist, which is complex, but true and interesting. And so the more complex we go, the more explanations are needed, right? And so it doesn't make sense that we could go all the way up to the least complex organisms and things and events in the universe, to the entire universe, which is space and time to the extreme. It is enclosed, but it's all of space and time and all the creatures in it together. To say that, to stop there and say that there is no explanation, there's no cause for this, even natural or supernatural, is insane, right? And so to explain the entire universe, we see that the universe doesn't explain itself, right? Nothing explains itself in this world. And so to see the entire universe, which is a part of the world, all of the world, we know that it doesn't explain itself. And so there has to be a cause. And that would be a supernatural cause, which is what we call God, a creator. Great. Okay, this is the argument from change. And I mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a philosopher and theologian in the 13th century. This was what was probably his favorite argument. And I modified it, but that's not because I'm smarter than Thomas Aquinas. That's because I'm not as smart. But this was his favorite argument. So see if it works. Again, all these arguments are supposed to be taken together. And just because we don't have certitude doesn't mean it can't be certain. So we observe in our natural world that everything is changing. There was a famous pre-Socratic philosopher named Heraclitus, and he said that no man steps in the same river twice, right? It sounds kind of like hippie or New Age or something like that, but it's actually true in a way, right? Even this podium, even me when I'm being still and I'm moving around a little bit, but even this podium is moving. There's always local motion when matter's involved. There's always movement. There's always entropy. Everything is always moving, even when it seems like it's still. Okay, so there's always change. We know that not just from knowing, but from touching, feeling, sensing. Our senses tell us this. Okay, so that brings us to the question, what really is change? What really is it? And so I'll take an example here of an acorn in a tree, right? So an acorn really is an acorn, but it's not a tree, right? It's potentially a tree. But something needs to happen between the stage of being a full-grown oak and being an acorn before it is a tree. So there has to be something that happens there. And we know that nothing can give itself what it does not have, right? So there needs to be something acting on it, right? There needs to be something from without. And so we would say that in the end, there has to be an unmoved mover because you can't have an infinite regress of causes, right? If everything is changing, then there can't be the first thing that was changed, that was not changing before all those changes happened. So another way to put it is, let's say that there was a library book, right, that would give you all the answers to your test, all the tests you would ever take in college. And let's say that I told you that, this book exists, but I don't have it. And you would say, okay, where is it? And I would say, it's at this library, go here. And you would go over there and ask them, and they would say, oh yeah, the book totally exists, but you have to go to this other library in Georgia, let's say. So you would go on the hunt for this. Let's say they keep saying the same thing. You go through all 50 states eventually, but they keep saying it's at the other library. And eventually you would either throw up your hands and leave, or say, is it really there? Is there really the library book in the first library? And if it's not, if they just keep saying it's at the next one, then you would know it doesn't really exist, right? And so the same thing with what causes change. If something is always changing, there needs to be something that started that series of changes. Okay. This is an interesting argument. This was an argument come up with by C.S. Lewis, who was the philosopher from England, the Anglican, and it's one of my favorites. It's called the argument from desire. So the first premise goes, every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. But there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, on earth, and no creature can satisfy. Therefore, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. And this something is God or life in God. Okay. So, a quick distinction. There's two kinds of desires, right? There's the artificial and the innate. The artificial and the innate. So, I have an artificial desire to see the Jags win the Super Bowl, right? That doesn't really exist. That's never going to happen. No. It might. But something like Narnia or something like The Shire, I also have a desire for that. But that's artificial. That's because Tolkien or Lewis came up with these stories in these fantasy lands. But they don't really exist. So these artificial desires could exist, but they could not exist. But when you go to innate desires, these always exist, right? So things like food and water, these are innate to us as biological organisms. Things like knowledge and friendship and love, these things are also innate within us as rational creatures with wills. So these all exist, these innate desires. And so it makes sense that since we're never fully satisfied by these desires, there's something in us that wants something more. There's something in us that wants something eternal. Socrates put it, or Plato put it, that we want the good forever. We want the good forever, immortality. And so this is life in God. This is our life in God. Now there is the objection that someone says, I'm perfectly happy with what I have here. And that would require a little bit of honest introspection. Are you really happy with, a beat-up car or even a nice car or this job? Even if you have everything perfect in the temporal realm, are you really happy? Are you really happy? And that weighs on people. So definitely pointing us towards something greater. Okay. This is a fun one. This is the argument from beauty. It's very long, so stay in your seats. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, therefore there must be a God. You either see this one or you don't. That's the argument. So one of my professors, Dr. Peter Kreeft, he said that he knew at least two people who were atheists, and they became Christians because they listened to Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, the St. Matthew Passion. So either in German or English, listen to that, and then share it with anyone who you might think need it. If you don't remember anything from this talk except listening to that would be a win. I would take that. So please listen to that. It's beyond beautiful. That cannot just be a series of chemical reactions. That's for certain. The ancient Greeks, I think about 100 years after Socrates, were basically atheists. They didn't believe in their gods. They didn't believe in Zeus. But they did believe, though, in one supernatural thing, and that was music, the power of music. They still believed in that. So that's how strong of a case music can bring for something beyond the material world. Also, I would recommend, while I'm doing recommendations, I would recommend the music that appeared in the sky, in the constellations, when Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to St. Juan Diego in the 16th century. Look at that. Look it up on YouTube. It's unbelievable. It's the music of the angels. So I would recommend that too if you're not satisfied by the St. Matthew Passion. Great. My next one is a very famous one. You've probably heard a version of it before, but it's the argument from morality, right? So real moral obligation is a fact. We are really, truly, and objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. So there's two views possible in the world. There's the atheistic view, that no God exists, or the religious theistic view, that God exists. But the atheistic view is incompatible with the first premise. Under atheism, you can't have objective morality that's binding. And I'll explain what that means more in a second. Therefore, the religious view wins out, just by a matter of fact. So God exists. The religious view wins. So I'm not saying that only some people claim that moral duties exist, right? Because certainly everyone would agree that people claim that all the time. And I'm also not claiming that some consequences feel worse or seem worse than others, given a moral act, but rather that humans are bound and objectively obligated to certain acts because of objective reality, how things are. We talk about natural laws nowadays in the scientific realm, in the scientific context, and that's fine. But the ancients talked about the natural law as something binding on our actions. Everything we do is a moral act in a way, or everything we choose not to do. And so if you decide to go against the natural law, which is in us naturally, innately, as St. Paul talks about in his letter to the Romans, then eventually you're going to come crashing down to earth, just like the law of gravity, right? If you jump off a moral cliff, eventually you're going to come down. You might glide for a bit, but you'll come down. And so this is the same way the ancients are talking about the moral law and how pressing it is and how important it is. So I'm also not saying that atheists can't live a life of relative virtue. They can, and the church teaches that. But they can't have the why. They can't have the person behind the moral law. So it's kind of like you sit down for a meal, but you refuse to, under all circumstances, acknowledge that there was a farmer, that there was an animal, that there was a chef that prepared the meal for you. So the whole person behind why that exists, the fact of morality, is neglected, is cast aside. So we can also say that atheists do recognize the moral law, but they recognize it at best as a brute fact. And so what that means is there's no real reason behind it, it just exists. But if your worldview has too many brute facts, then it's your worldview that needs adjusting, not the facts themselves. If you had a worldview that said alligators can't exist, I absolutely refuse to believe alligators exist, but you went to Florida, then you would have to adjust your worldview. I mean, you wouldn't have to say Florida doesn't exist, right? You would have to adjust your worldview for the data, So also, under the atheist worldview, you can't really have immaterial substances. And so desire and will, which are things pointed to by a lot of atheists, they ultimately have chemical reasons, chemical reactions that are bringing them on. And so these are amoral, right? Matter itself isn't moral or immoral. It's moral agents that are. And so if everything's just matter, that points us towards a lack of morality. But again, we all know that moral facts exist, right? Slavery is wrong, for example. Stealing is wrong. And we know this absolutely. Okay. More on this, because it's such an interesting argument. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, talks about moral language. We see this in little kids, right? They talk about playing fair, taking my turn. So these things are a matter of justice. They recognize it innately. And also, even the biggest moral relativist, as soon as you harm him, as soon as you steal his money, he's going to take up arms, right? And rightfully so. So at the end of the day, everyone recognizes it, especially when pressed by their own needs and circumstances. There's another argument. It's kind of a dangerous one. It's the argument from conscience that's very much related to this. And St. John Henry Newman, the English bishop, came up with this, actually. And so basically, there's only a certain amount of things that can point you towards, or everyone knows that they have to follow their conscience. Everyone knows they have to follow their conscience. Everyone says this, everyone knows this. But when you show the atheistic view on what a conscience is, this actually shows them that, oh no, they don't, under their worldview. So it's a dangerous argument. And Dr. Kreeft told me one time that he was once debating a bunch of pro-choice people and pro-abortion choice people, and they eventually said that, Peter Kreeft, you convinced us, congratulations. And he said, using this argument, and he said, oh great, so you're pro-life? And they said, no, we're pro-infanticide. So it's a dangerous argument, but it does show the logical necessity of the argument. So it goes that we all know that we have to listen to our consciences. And where does that come from? So it either comes from us, right? It either comes from the individual. And why do you have to listen to yourself, though, right? If you lock yourself in a room, you can lock yourself out. There's no absolute moral necessity of keeping yourself to some morality. Also, it could come from society, right? But why do you have to listen to society? Society is a collection of individuals, right? They have no more moral binding on you than you do on yourself. And so it doesn't make sense that you would listen to them either. And the conscience can't come from below, right? And if it does, then why would you listen to mere matter, dumb matter? That doesn't make much sense either. Great. So that's the three views under the atheistic view. So it makes sense that conscience actually doesn't have to be followed. But under the theistic view, under the religious view, we see that the conscience comes from God. It's our moral calculator, so it involves what we know already and then what we could know. But it comes from God. It's Christ talking in us. So we see that conscience can only be followed rightfully with any sort of obedience or dutifulness when we know it comes from God. And so that shows that the atheistic view doesn't make sense there, because everyone knows to follow their conscience. Excellent. Okay, those were just several arguments on proving the existence of God. Again, if you don't think those were tight, if those were great, it's probably partly because of me, but also because we're going through this very quickly, and there's many arguments that combine together to give us a fairly clear picture of God, just about some of his attributes. And so, again, it's not the God of the Bible, who we know and love, but this is the God of the philosophers, right? So certain attributes like his first cause, being the maker of morality, right? And being absolute beauty itself, and the most perfect being there could be. So these are just little hints of God, traces of God, but we can prove them through them. And I like to give credit, too, for Dr. Peter Kreeft and Father Ronald Tiselli, their Handbook of Christian Apologetics. If you want to get more of these arguments, look there. And then a couple of Dominican priests as well, who I got some arguments from. So, yeah, these great arguments and others like them can be found in many places, but especially that handbook. And then also for atheism, we'll talk about that more in week 3, refuting arguments for atheism and skepticism. But I'll say that the arguments for God's existence far outweigh the arguments for atheism. And the arguments from atheism, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the only two good ones are the problem of evil and apparently science would disprove the existence of God. And so we'll get into that again in week 3, and I look forward to that, but they're not as strong as these. So yeah, that was your purgatory, and I'm glad you made it out, and now let heaven begin. So any questions, just shout them out or raise your hand, and I'd be happy to answer them. So, yeah.
When you gave the example about the dinner and that there was a chef and there was,
Yes.
reasons behind it, why they exist, and then you said the atheists just believe they exist. So if the atheist can believe that they just exist, why don't they believe that God just exists?
Right. Yeah, so the atheist certainly would say, it's an analogy. So the atheist would certainly say that, the farmer exists, the animal exists, the grains exist, and the chef exists who gave all this to him, right? And so this points up towards that there are explanations behind these things that exist, right? These facts that we enjoy, right? And, morality can be difficult sometimes, but also it's something we enjoy, right? We love the fact that we have a just God, right? We love that there's justice and truth, even though oftentimes it falls short in our fallen world. We love that they really exist, and they're binding on each of us, and we all know them to one extent or another. So for the atheist, though, I would press them to say, well, it makes sense that all these things have explanations, right? Including where your dinner comes from. But does it make sense that something that's so important, like moral objectivity, doesn't have a reason behind it? That would kind of perplex me. And so that's what I would push against or ask the atheist on that one. So, yeah, thank you. Good question. Yes?
We're talking about conscience. A lot of times people say, let your conscience be your guide. If your conscience isn't formed properly, then your guide's going to be way off in left field, so to speak. But do you believe that maybe when a person has not been formed properly, and then they come into a true relationship with God, believing in Him and His Son, and the personal relationship, that could help the conscience change quickly, that input of God in one's life can make that view completely go 180?
Great question. Yeah. So this is where faith comes into it. And so during week 4, we'll talk about how our Catholic faith relates to philosophy in our minds. And so with that, yeah, there are infused graces, and that's a complex theological term. We can get into that in week 4, that come into someone when they decide to live in obedience and right relationship with God. And so this can often come through a full knowing, or a knowing that's satisfactory of God's promises and what comes from Him, and that God exists, that Jesus is His only Son, the truths of the Catholic Church, etc. Right? But I think that for some people who dismiss God, especially the God of the Bible, the God of our fathers, the God of the Catholic Church, as kind of like, an imaginary friend, like I mentioned earlier, I think for people like that, they could latch onto these arguments. God as a first cause, God as the person, the being behind morality and beauty, the yardstick for all goodness in the world. They could latch onto those and then sort of see how this leads to something like the God of the Bible. And so it's almost like if you're going on a date, you go on one or two dates, and you know something about the other person, right? But you don't know that much. If you go on 7, 8, 9, 10, 40, 50, you're going to know the person extremely well, almost as well as yourself. And so over time, you get to know someone, and you jump into their arms, in a sense, in trusting them. So if they tell you something very personal on the 50th date, well, you already have 49 dates before that to say, does this make sense with what I know about the person? Well, it does. So the same thing with arguments for God's existence. What I just talked about is like the first 2 or 3 dates. And then later on, you can say, it makes sense that God, who's outside of time, can come into time in such a profound way and not lose his dignity because of it, like with Jesus in the incarnation. So, yeah, it definitely relates to it. And, yeah, it's so important to have an active faith. And but also, these arguments can appeal to people who are agnostic or on the fence. So, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
What was the C.S. Lewis book you talked about? Was it Inner Christianity?
That's right. So the first quote I did of Lewis about you can never be too careful what books you read as an atheist, that was from his autobiography called Surprised by Joy. And then Mere Christianity is the other book I mentioned. So Mere Christianity is Lewis's defense of what he termed mere Christianity, which is just the basics, what he thought, the basics of the Christian religion. And so we would say that another basic of it is that Jesus established a church, right, the Catholic Church. But him as an Anglican, he's trying to write and appealing to all Christians in talking about what truths we believe, what we hold on to. And so he makes his argument for God's existence from morality in that book. And I think that's the most popular version and most well-cited version of the argument today. So he makes a good argument, and I would really recommend C.S. Lewis. He's a wonderful theologian and writer. He's not a Catholic, but you can sift out where he's wrong. But he's a wonderful writer and definitely a holy man. So, yeah, but thanks for the question.
All right. So I've also heard the argument that this morality and rules are learned. Our evolution took us to a point where this is the way we need to behave, so society is a good society, right? A functioning society. It's not, it's not something that comes from God. It's just we, through the millennia, learned it, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So evolution is cited a lot by atheists when they talk about morality, right? It's a learned behavior. I think an important thing, though, to keep in mind with evolution is that just because you can think, right, you can think in a conscious way, You can not just have emotions and have inclinations that move you towards food and water and other survival mechanisms. That doesn't mean that you're going to do it better just because you can think consciously, because you can think abstractly, you can think about beauty, you can think about things like God. That doesn't actually help you survive at all. If it wasn't for, there's a funny philosopher, G.K. Chesterton. He apparently one time got lost when he was just in downtown London. He lived in London. And he apparently called his wife and asked her, what am I supposed to be doing right now? After he just got marching orders from her just a little bit ago. So he was a very smart man, very abstract man. He's a philosopher. And so just because he was thinking about all these things in the abstract, he was thinking about all these things that go beyond sort of the day-to-day, doesn't mean he was going to survive. And without his wife, he probably would have never got home or been a lot less successful. So just because you have evolutionary features, and Pope Benedict XVI said that evolution's more than a theory, right? So we don't oppose evolution in the Catholic Church. The Church doesn't have an official stance on it because the Church only makes official stances on faith and reason, or faith and morals. But the Church, developing on, Pope Benedict has said it's more than a theory, right? And Pope Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, said that you could hold it as a Catholic, right? I think more proof points to it than others. So you can hold it for sure, but it doesn't actually show that we're more likely to survive because we can cling on to moral truths, right, that animals don't. And we can cling on to abstract goods like truth, beauty, and goodness that other animals don't. This doesn't actually make it easier for us to survive. So that destroys the argument the way I see it, yeah. Thank you.
You speak about the change and cause. So what is the cause for God, and does God change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is a common objection. John Stuart Mill and, what's his name? Another famous philosopher in the 20th century posed this, right? And so when we're talking about God as first cause, we're not talking about as a being, right? So, even atheists could say maybe there are immaterial beings, right? I don't know how you get to that, but let's say they say that. They would say that God is some sort of an angel, could move these material creatures, but he would still need someone to cause him, right? And so the argument I was getting at, and I'll explain more here, is called a reductio ad absurdum. And that's, a fancy Latin term. What it basically means is the other argument, the only other alternative, makes no sense, right? So if you have, let's say you have a god or something, according to like a Greek pantheon, right? But you keep having gods move them, then you would have an infinite regress, right? You would have an infinite amount of dominoes when there's no first domino for you to start hitting and falling down. So we can't have that. That makes no sense to have an infinite amount of causes, right? There has to, at some point, be a first cause. And so with God, we're not talking about a being. We're talking about something that doesn't respond, that isn't changed itself, right? So something outside of time, outside of space. And so that is God. Because the alternative doesn't make any sense, right? So we get to that just from the alternative being ridiculous. And so what was the second question?
Does God change?
Does God change, right? So the same thing there, right? So God is outside of space and time. And we know that something is outside of space and time. Again, not the God of the Bible, just from this one argument. But there's something that is outside of what is changed, out of matter, what is being moved about, going from one state to another. If it wasn't, again, there would be an infinite regress of causes, and that makes no sense. So there's something there. And again, not the God of the Bible, but something that starts all these changes. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you think the movement towards artificial intelligence will impact people's belief in God?
It's a great question. I took a class on artificial intelligence, specifically ChatGPT and biotechnologies at Boston College. It was a philosophy class. There was a lot of good discussion on it. So I think that a lot of times technology tends towards a secular attitude, right? So oftentimes technology is just used for like social media, right? And so TikTok, and so it ends up shortening attention spans and making people focus on, the very much here and now, like the immediate news feed or something like that. And that can be a problem, right? That can be problematic. So I think that technology is a good, right? We're not Luddites as Catholics. Everything that exists was made good. And so even technology, which is made by us as secondary causes, is a good thing, right? Think about medical technology. I had an appendectomy, so if it wasn't for that, modern medical technology, I wouldn't be here with you guys today. So it's a great good, but it can be used for evil. And oftentimes, I think like these ChatGPT programs and technologies, they can be used for cheating on tests, for example. And yeah, just for things that don't bring the soul closer to God. And so it's good to use it in moderation. It's good to, these technologies, at least in a way that glorifies God. And so being cognizant of that, talking to children about it, it's very important. So yeah, great question though. And it's a big issue that's going to keep getting bigger. So keep an eye out on that.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis? My understanding,
Yeah.
I've read somewhere that at the end of, I guess, when Lewis was dying, he says something that if he had lived longer, he probably have converted to Catholicism by the influence of Tolkien, who was Catholic, right?
Yeah, that's right. So Tolkien actually asked C.S. Lewis one time, Clive, why don't you become Catholic? Why don't you swim the Tiber? And Lewis said something like, as a son of a Northern Irish Ulster man, I would never consider it. That's ridiculous, and I hereby command you never to ask me that question again. Something like that, something very intense. But Lewis was very logical. He was a philosopher. And so it doesn't make sense that he said that. He was probably saying it in jest. So it doesn't make much sense why C.S. Lewis didn't become a Catholic. I think he would today, for certain. There's a lot of problems with the Anglican Church, even then, but also especially now. And so I think that Lewis would be a Catholic today. But Tolkien was a Catholic, and Tolkien was an amazing man, and a very funny man, too. He was a philologist, so he studied language. And he would come into his classes with a giant wheelbarrow. And he would point at the wheelbarrow and say to his students, he said, students, I need all of these books in this wheelbarrow to be in your heads at the end of the semester. And then the last day of the semester, he would wheel it in the wheelbarrow again with all the books, and he would throw it out onto the stage and then walk away and say, you all know these now, you don't need them anymore. And that was the last class. And so I think with Tolkien, for sure, he understood that being a Catholic didn't mean just, being a stick in the mud or, not being open to humor and beauty and goodness. He was the one who wrote The Lord of the Rings, which was voted, I think, by 3 separate big book retailers, the best book of the 20th century and the best book of all time. So, Lord of the Rings, Lewis's Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce, great books. And Lewis definitely has a Catholic sensibility. He said he was a medieval. And so we know a lot of the medieval culture points towards truth, beauty, and goodness. And so I think he would be a Catholic if he was here today, but kind of inexplicable why he wasn't. So, good question. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope you have a blessed day. We'll be back not next week, but the week after, I believe at 9:15 that Thursday, whatever it is. So thank you all for coming, and God bless you.